Hi, my name is Jake, and I am a bookish drummer. So for this Stephen King video, I will be discussing the best Stephen King horror books of all time. At least in my opinion, because y'all might disagree with me. There's probably going to be some books that are excluded from this list, and I'll talk about that at the end. But I have 15 books to talk about, and I think this covers definitely my favorite horror books that Stephen King has ever written. And of course, I've talked about my favorite Stephen King books in general, but honestly, a lot of my favorites, I think half of my top 10 are not horror books. So things like The Dead Zone, Different Seasons, Dark Tower stuff, and even some collections of his are not really considered horror. But these 15 books are going to be my absolute favorite Stephen King horror books. And then I'll save, I guess, some honorable mentions at the end that are just, they're very popular, but they're just not my favorite. So with all that being said, let's go ahead and jump right into it. So I'm going to first knock out some Stephen King collections here. Later on in his career, his collections are not really horror. There are some horror, but he definitely becomes more literary. But definitely in his early career, things like Night Shift, for sure, and Skeleton Crew are definitely his scariest and creepiest and his most horror-filled short story collections. Definitely my favorite is still Night Shift. This is in my top 10 Stephen King books of all time. It's one of my favorite Stephen King collections to go back and reread. It obviously has just tons of horror-filled short stories. You've got, obviously, Jerusalem's Lot, Graveyard Shift, Eye in the Doorway, The Mangler, The Boogeyman, Gray Matter, Sometimes They Come Back, The Ledge, The Lawnmower Man, Quitters Inc., Children of the Corn. The list just goes on and on. Like, almost all of these short stories I would consider horror, or at least horror adjacent. Definitely one of the best horror collections. Some people would say that Skeleton Crew is his best, and it definitely has some heavy hitters. You've got stuff like The Jaunt, Survivor Type, The Raft, The Mist, Mrs. Todd's Shortcut, Word Processor of the Gods, The Monkey, which is not one of my favorites, but, you know, just, this is very horror-filled. Again, this came out, I think, this one came out in 78, I believe, and this one came out in 85. So early on in his career, most of his short stories, I would argue, are horror-leaning. He gets later on in his career, and they're a bit more literary. But later on in his career, he did have a couple of collections that I would consider horror-leaning. Definitely Full Dark, No Stars. Definitely his creepiest and scariest novella collection. His other ones are, I would argue, a bit more literary-leaning. Maybe not 4 Past Midnight, but that one isn't one of my favorites. It's got 2 novellas that aren't quite as good. But Full Dark, No Stars, man, just 4 really dark tales. Really, like, just dark and depressing stuff. Very creepy and just works really well. This collection definitely deserves to be on this list. And one of his newest books, his newest collection, You Like It Darker. It's got darker right in the name. This is Stephen King going back to his roots, writing just a bunch of really creepy, dark stuff. You've got things like Two Talented Bastards, The Fifth Step, Danny Coughlin's Bad Dream, On Slide In Road, Red Screen, The Turbulence Expert, Rattlesnakes, The Answer Man, just a lot of really great horror stuff. This is kind of him harkening back to his older days with Night Shift and Skeleton Crew, going back and writing just really creepy stuff. So this definitely deserves to be on this list. So these 4 collections out of a dozen or so collections that he's written over the years, I think deserve to be on the list. Now I'm going to talk about 2 books that go basically together like peanut butter and chocolate. A lot of people will not agree with that, but I think The Shining and Dr. Sleep are definitely worth being on this list. Obviously, this one's tough for me, but I think The Shining I would consider the better horror novel. But I do like Doctor Sleep a bit more. I don't think it's as scary or creepy. I think The Shining definitely wins in the scary factor, but I think Doctor Sleep does have its creepy moments, and I think it's just better written. But The Shining obviously is a classic in the horror genre for a reason. But for me, I would be hesitant to not include both of these on this list. So definitely comment down below whether you like The Shining or Doctor Sleep more. I'm sure The Shining is going to win in the end. But for me, I've just enjoyed Doctor Sleep the more that I've reread it. Which one is scarier? Probably The Shining, but I think they both deserve to be on the list. And I don't know if I've mentioned this yet, but I'm not really going in any kind of order here. But I will save my favorite Stephen King horror book for last. You guys might be able to guess what it is because it's one of my favorites. But leave that towards the end. The rest of these are just kind of in random ass order. And speaking of that, we're going to go with Needful Things. This is also in my top 10 Stephen King books of all time. And this one is kind of a more slow descent into madness because if you don't know, this book starts out with a guy named Leland Gaunt who opens a store in Castle Rock, and he doesn't want money for the items that he's selling. He wants people to do kind of small favors and kind of weird pranks on other people in the town. And when people start doing those, they start colliding with each other and chaos ensues. So it's kind of a slow descent into madness. And I would argue this is one of Stephen King's best chunky books. I recently reread The Tommyknockers. That's a chunky book. The pacing in that is very wonky, but the pacing in this, it's 700 pages with very tiny font, but it works so well. And I love the slow descent into chaos. So this is definitely one of my favorite Stephen King horror novels he's ever written. And most of the books on this list are going to be from early on in his career. Later on in his career, some of his horror novels don't work well for me, and then he starts to write in other genres. While I think they're good, they're definitely not horror. But this one is a newer one, and it works really well for me. Duma Key is definitely one of my favorite horror novels, and just horror, or just novels in general, that Stephen King has ever written. Duma Key is also one of the more unique ones because most of his horror novels takes place in small towns, in really cold and wintry environments, but he decides to make this in Florida, an island in Duma Key, Florida, a made-up town, if I believe. This one is just very unique. It's always been one of my favorites. Has the best friendship that Stephen King has ever written, or at least one of them. That might be jumping the gun there, but definitely one of the best friendships. And the horror elements in here, they take a little bit of getting to, like it doesn't happen right away. But when it does, it happens, and it's one of my favorites. So, one of my favorite newer Stephen King horror books. And I will say that most of Stephen King's, like, Richard Bachman books, I wouldn't necessarily consider horror. You got stuff like The Long Walk and The Running Man, which are kind of more dystopian. And then you've got something like The Regulators, which I don't even know what to call that. That's just a weird-ass book. And then Blaze, even though I love that book, I wouldn't necessarily consider it a horror book. But one of Richard Bachman books that I would consider horror that I really personally enjoy is Thinner. This one is maybe more on the horror comedy kind of things because it's got a very goofy premise where this guy accidentally runs over a gypsy and this other gypsy puts a curse on him. Thinner. And he's this really big fat lawyer guy who weighs like, I think over 300 pounds, or I don't know how he weighs, but he starts losing weight even though he's not exercising or dieting. And he's like, oh, look at me, I'm losing all this weight. But it eventually gets to the point where it gets dangerous, where like he's skin and bones and he's got to figure out how to stop this gypsy curse. So it's obnoxious and it's just like off the wall. Like, where did he come up with this idea? But it's a really fun horror book for me personally. And it's always been one of my favorite Richard Bachman books. So that's why it's going on the list here as one of Stephen King's best horror books. And the rest of the books I have to talk about are definitely on the older side. I do think, in general, Stephen King horror books just had a different feel to them back in the 70s and 80s. That's not to say that he doesn't have great horror books from... And actually, you know what? I'm missing one. What the hell am I doing? Well, clearly I'm not prepared for this because I just remembered another one that had to be on the list here. I'm a bit dazzled at the moment, but one that I recently just reread for the Stephen King Book Club was Revival. And this is one that I do often cite as a book that constant readers who view older King as better, especially like his older horror stuff from the 70s and 80s, like I mentioned, should definitely read this, check it out, because it has that same feel that older King books have. It's got that grit to it, and the ending is one that you'll never forget. I think this is great modern day Stephen King horror. So I wanted to include this here because I almost forgot it, and that would have just really messed me up. So yeah, Revival, definitely a great modern Stephen King horror novel. Okay, so now the rest of these are going to be older. Let me just do a quick view of the shelves and make sure that I'm not forgetting anything else, because that would be very awkward. I think we're good. Definitely comment down below if I'm nailing these, and just wait till the end, because there's probably going to be a couple that I'm leaving off the list that probably a lot of y'all are like, what the hell, Jake? But anyway, these are older King books that I think are great horror books. And I'm going all the way back to the beginning with Carrie. Now, I wouldn't necessarily say this is like a scary book, like with all of these other, or for most of these horror books, but I think it is a horrifying experience that Carrie goes through in this book. And I think it just has, it gets to me. And I know a lot of people don't cite this as some of their all-time favorite Stephen King books, but Carrie just really does it for me. And just putting yourself in her shoes, just, you know, having empathy for Carrie and her plight, I think really helps. And Carrie, you know, while this is obviously his debut, so it's not necessarily his best writing or his best character work, but it's iconic. It's a classic for a reason. It's, you know, 50 years old now, and I think it still works to this day. And it's always been one of my favorite Stephen King horror novels. Fight me in the comments, because this one is fantastic. You could argue maybe it's a sci-fi, but I still consider it's a horror book. A couple days ago, I made a vampire video, and obviously one of my favorite vampire novels is Salem's Lot. Now, is this one of my all-time favorite Stephen King books? No. Does it have the best character work like his other books do? No. But this is definitely one of the creepiest and scariest Stephen King books that he's ever written. The vampires in here are very scary, they just work really well in this small town, and these poor townsfolk just get run over with vampires, and I think the horror elements work really well in here. It's not one of my favorites, like I mentioned, because the character work, I love some of Stephen King's other characters a lot more, but the villains and the vampires themselves are very horrific, and I think it works really well as a horror novel. This next book is maybe a bit lighter on the horror. Like, you could even argue, as my buddy Ian from Ian the Reader, somebody could probably shelve this into the young adult section, but I'd still consider it a horror novel, and that would be Christine. This was our book that we read last month in September for the Stephen King Book Club, and I think I do agree with Ian that this one could be marketed as a young adult book, because the characters in here are young adults. They're in high school, and they're doing high school things. There just happens to be a creepy car going around killing people. And I think it works really well. And when the horror does set in, like, it's pretty creepy. Like, just thinking about, like, this possessed car, like, it is kind of a silly concept, but he makes it work. Stephen King is really good at creating, like, really silly concepts that at surface level, you're like, okay, this is kind of dumb. But it works really well, mainly because of the characters. I love the characters in this book. Kind of unlike Salem's Lot, where I'm like, the horror in there is really good, but the characters are lacking. The characters are what makes this book. It isn't necessarily the scariest Stephen King book, but it is one of his better horror books because of the characters. So highly recommend this one as well, obviously, with all of these. Next up, we have a Stephen King book that I could maybe argue is underrated. A lot of people have read it. A lot of people know it. It is iconic. But do a lot of people love this King book? Not necessarily. Definitely not as much as I do. I think Cujo is definitely one of his best horror books and one of his scariest. Now, I know there's a random hair there. Is it Cujo's hair? Ah! But anyway, I know that the first half of this book isn't necessarily very scary, and the horror elements don't necessarily set into the second half of the book, where Cujo is doing Cujo things. But this book really works well for me. Like I mentioned, the characters are really well done in here. The first half is basically kind of more of a drama, but I think it's all perfectly set up for the second half. The second half is very terrifying because you get attached to these characters. And the horror just really works well for me in here. And I love Stephen King horror that is realistic. And this could realistically happen, like getting locked in a car and you can't leave because there's a rabid dog. That could happen. It's unlikely, but it could happen. And yeah, this is one that's just always one that terrifies me because, like, especially as a mailman, like going up to a house and you don't know. Sometimes, like, once you get used to the area, like you kind of know which dogs are good, but you never know. Random dog could be bit by a bat one day, and then I go, oh hey, and then ah. But yeah, Cujo, definitely one of the best Stephen King horror novels, in my opinion. Fight me in the comments. I love this book. Next up, we would have probably a lot of people's number one pick for Stephen King's best horror novels. And I do really enjoy this book, but I do have problems with it. But again, that's a lot of buts in this video. But I think the horror elements in this book work really well. And one of Stephen King's most iconic villains. I'm, of course, talking about It. And again, this is a lot of people's favorite Stephen King horror novel, and just horror novel by any author. And obviously Pennywise, the dancing clown, one of the most iconic horror villains ever. And you guys know my faults with the book. It's a bit chunky, the editing, like it could have been edited down a little bit. But the villain, the characters, the Losers Club, the horror elements, I do think work really well. I don't necessarily find it that scary for me personally because, like I mentioned, I think Stephen King does realistic horror better, but there are some terrifying scenes in here. I think it works really well, and yeah, it had to be on the list, obviously. I wasn't going to exclude this one. Now, there are a couple of other ones that I'm going to exclude that you might get mad at me, but this, of course, had to be on the list. And if I'm not missing anything, God help me, I'm not missing anything else, we come to my favorite horror novel. Well, my favorite Stephen King horror novel of all time, for sure. And quite possibly my favorite horror novel of all time. There's obviously contenders from other authors. There's Imaginary Friend by Stephen Chbosky. There's Just Like Home by Sarah Gailey. There's Baby Teeth by Zoe Stage. There's Stephen Graham Jones, Nat Cassidy. Like, tons of great horror books. But as far as Stephen King goes, Misery is his best horror book, in my opinion. This is definitely one of the scariest books I've ever read, not just from Stephen King, but by any author. And of course, when I read the book, I had seen the movie because I had watched a bunch of Stephen King movies growing up. But I think for me, the book is somehow even more terrifying. Like he really puts the reader in Paul Sheldon's shoes. And it's just putting yourself in the mindset of Paul Sheldon and like what you would be capable of doing to try to get out of this situation is terrifying. And then, you know, there's obviously the scene in the movie, but I think the scene in the book is more terrifying, and it's just more gruesome, and just this book is so good, y'all. And it's my favorite horror book by Stephen King, but it's my second favorite of him overall. Obviously, The Dead Zone is still my favorite. I don't necessarily consider that a horror book, though. I consider that more a mishmash of a bunch of different genres. I would classify that more as like thriller, suspense, not necessarily, and even sci-fi. But this one is just straight up horror. It's his best horror book, in my opinion. Comment down below if you agree or disagree with me about that. But yeah, Misery is definitely my favorite Stephen King horror novel. All right, so that's like 15, maybe 16. I've lost count at this point. But generally, these are the best Stephen King horror books, in my personal opinion. Now, there are two that I mentioned that aren't on this list. I will mention them here, but they're not my favorites. They're some of the most overrated Stephen King horror books, in my opinion. Number one, and a lot of people just love this book so much, is The Stand. I really enjoy the character work, and I really like part one, which has a lot to do with the actual apocalypse. After that, I think it's a slog to get through, and I don't love the direction of the story. So part one, like where the horror elements are, works really well for me. You could even argue this isn't necessarily a straight up horror novel. Like you could argue it's fantasy, sci-fi. Like, there's a lot of stuff in here. Part 1 of this is really good, but it's a 3-star book, one of Stephen King's most overrated books. This next one is just a straight-up horror novel that I have a lot of problems with that I did a rant review for a while ago. Go check that out because I'm not going to go into it in this one. Pet Sematary, 3 stars. It's overrated. It does have some interesting horror elements and scenes to it, but overall, I have a lot of problems with it. It's just not one of my favorites. Fight me down in the comments below, but it's not coming on this list here. It's honorable mention, I guess, because it's not the worst thing that Stephen King has written in the horror genre, but I do have a lot of problems with it. So Pet Sematary and The Stand, both not on my list. Fight me. But yeah, I'll just do a quick recap here. This is going to be all over the place because the books are on the ground, but you got The Shining and Dr. Sleep, which I think work really well together. You got Duma Key, one of his better modern horror books. Revival, also, which I almost forgot, which would have been just... You've got my one Richard Bachman book, Thinner. His other Bachman books are great for the most part, but a lot of them I wouldn't necessarily consider horror. You've got Carrie, the OG. I don't know where Salem's Lot went, but that's here as well. Needful Things, which the cover of this is kind of slowly falling apart. Oh boy. You got collections. You've got Full Dark No Stars. His newest one, You Like It Darker, which is kind of a return to form, at least for horror. Skeleton Crew and Night Shift, just some of his best horror short stories. All right, there's Salem's Lot. I'm wondering where that went. What else is there? There's Christine, which isn't necessarily that scary, but I think it is one of his best horror books. And then, in my opinion, probably the big 3, Cujo, It, and Misery. Maybe The Shining would be up there too, but I don't know. I keep just liking Dr. Sleep more and more. Yeah, so, yeah, just overall, I'm not really ranking these, but number 1 is Misery. The other ones, they're wherever they will be, if that makes any kind of sense. But yeah, those are my favorite Stephen King horror books of all time. Definitely comment down below if you agree or disagree with me. I'm pretty sure I'm going to have some people disagreeing about Pet Sematary and The Stand, or maybe they think It is the best horror book, and maybe there's some other ones that I didn't even mention. Like, I know people love, like, Desperation, Under the Dome. I'm sure there's some Cell lovers out there, The Dark Half. I'm sure there's other stuff, but I think I've covered most of his best horror books, at least in my opinion. But definitely comment down below what I missed, like what am I off on. Just blast me in the comments down below. Also comment down below what are some other Stephen King related videos you want to see in the future. I will be doing, I think next Friday, my Cycle of the Werewolf review, and then I think there are some other reviews that people want to see, but I also want to make some more lists, so like top 10 lists. Like, do I tackle some characters? Do I tackle... I don't know. Just comment down below. It's going to be impossible for me to run out of ideas because Stephen King has so many books, but I need some help now and then. So comment that down below. And of course, thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a quick thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Stay subscribed for more content. I try to post every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Obviously Friday for Stephen King Fridays. Next week's going to be my Cycle of the Werewolf review. I think could change my mind, but I think that's what I'm going to do. Book a Strummer Discord down below where we've got tons of buddy reads and read-alongs happening all the damn time, including the Stephen King book club run by myself and Ian from Ian the Reader. We're going to be tackling Roadwork in November. Not a horror book and not a lot of people's favorites, but check it out. You might be surprised by how much you like it. Or you could hate it. Let's find out together. There's also my Patreon link down below if you want to go support me there for as little as $1 a month, y'all. And my Amazon wishlist if you'd like to buy me a book. Thank you guys so much for watching. Have a fantastic day.